The moment I stepped into the private room at the back of the restaurant in Menlo Park, I knew this wasn't the casual family brunch my mom had promised. The lights were too bright, cutting through the heavy air like clinical scalpels. The table was too clean, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the predatory gleam in my mother's eyes. There was a thick stack of paperwork sitting in the middle of the table, resting next to a heavy fountain pen that certainly wasn't mine. I didn't need a degree in forensic accounting to see the trap. My father had been dead for exactly 14 days, and his version of a legacy was already being treated like a carcass by the people who shared his dinner table, but never his heart. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I stood there for a heartbeat, my hand still resting on the cool brass of the door handle. I am Emily. I am 26 years old. I spend my days as a cybersecurity expert, hunting for vulnerabilities in complex systems. It is a job that requires me to be cold, methodical, and suspicious by default. Looking at that table, I realized the vulnerability in my own life had a name: Melissa, my mother. She sat at the head of the table, her posture as rigid as a corporate board member. She didn't look like a grieving widow, she looked like a CEO closing a hostile takeover. To her right was Joshua, my stepfather, a man whose smile always felt like a pre-recorded message. And then there was the stranger. A man in a charcoal suit, laptop open, his eyes fixed on me instead of the menu. He wasn't there for the Eggs Benedict. "Emily, darling, sit down," my mother said. Her voice was smooth, coated in that false warmth she usually reserved for social media captions. "We just need to talk about what is fair. Now that your father is gone, we have to think about the family as a whole." I didn't sit. I remained standing, my gaze dropping to the paperwork. I recognized the formatting. It was a redistribution agreement. They weren't asking for my input, they were demanding my signature. According to the bold black ink on the first page, they wanted me to voluntarily transfer 70% of my father's founding shares in his artificial intelligence startup. We were talking about a stake worth $25 million. My father, Richard, had built that company from a garage in Silicon Valley while my mother was busy choosing the right shade of marble for a kitchen he never had time to cook in. He had worked 80-hour weeks, driven a 10-year-old car, and skipped vacations so that his daughter, the only person who actually coded with him on Saturday nights, would never have to beg for a future. And now, the stranger in the suit slid the agreement across the table toward me. He didn't introduce himself, he just tapped the signature line with a manicured finger. "It is for the good of the family," my mother added. She folded her hands like a judge delivering a sentence. Madison and Jacob, Joshua's children, sat across from me, staring with a mixture of boredom and entitlement. They had spent their lives spending money they didn't earn, and now they were looking at me as if I was the one guilty of a crime for wanting to keep what was mine. "You have to think about Madison and Jacob's college funds," Melissa continued, her voice sharpening. "Your father's will was impulsive. He wasn't thinking about the reality of our current life. This is about balance, Emily. This is about making sure everyone is provided for." I looked at the pen. Then I looked at her. My father's will wasn't impulsive. It was a shield. He knew exactly what kind of vultures would circle the moment his pulse stopped. "And if I don't sign?" I asked. My voice was flat. I didn't cry. I treated the question like a logic gate in a piece of code. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The false smiles evaporated instantly. Joshua leaned forward, his laptop screen glowing with a series of open tabs that looked suspiciously like my own credit history. "Then this gets complicated, Emily," Joshua said. "We can drag this through the courts for years. We can challenge your father's mental state at the time the will was signed. We can freeze every single asset you think you own. Your credit will be ruined. Your reputation in this town will be finished. We are trying to handle this privately, like adults. Don't make us do this the hard way." I felt my heart pounding, a rhythmic thud against my ribs, but my mind stayed clear. Clinical. I remembered my dad sitting at the edge of my bed when the divorce was finalized years ago. He told me that shared DNA is a biological fact, but loyalty is a financial and emotional contract. He told me to never let anyone use my heart to get into my wallet. I looked around the table. I started counting, pointing my finger at each of them slowly, deliberately. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I said out loud. They frowned, looking at each other in confusion. Melissa huffed, rolling her eyes. Emily, what are you doing? This isn't a game. I smiled for the first time that day. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter who realized the trap was actually reversed. You are a lot of people, I said calmly. And you've brought a lawyer to a brunch. That is a heavy-handed move. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I tapped a single button on a pre-written draft. The funny thing is, I added, setting the phone face down next to their untouched pen, I only brought one person, too. A sharp, precise knock sounded on the door. It wasn't a tentative knock. It was the sound of authority. The hostess opened the door just enough to let a woman in a navy blazer step through. She was 78 years old, her hair a silver crown, her eyes like polished steel. She carried a folder that looked much more substantial than the one on the table. Hello, Melissa, Catherine said, her voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. I hear you wanted to talk about Emily's inheritance. I am Catherine, Richard's personal attorney and the executor of his estate. Since you've decided to turn a family meeting into a legal deposition, I thought I should join the conversation. The silence that followed Catherine's entrance was heavy, clinical, and absolute. I didn't waste a single second of it. While Melissa's mouth hung open, and Joshua frantically tried to tilt his laptop screen away from my line of sight, I went back to my own device. I wasn't interested in their shock. I was interested in the logs. Joshua, I said, my voice cutting through the lawyer's opening murmurs. You should probably stop the packet sniffing. I've already traced the hardware address back to your laptop. I've logged the attempt, the timestamp, and the specific address. In this state, attempted unauthorized access to a protected computer system is a felony. So, if you want to keep that expensive suit and not trade it for a jumpsuit, I suggest you close that lid right now. Joshua turned a shade of gray that matched his expensive blazer. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. He just snapped the laptop shut with a sound that felt like a gavel hitting a block. What is she talking about? Melissa demanded, her voice rising an octave. Joshua was just helping with the paperwork. Catherine, this is a private family matter. You have no right to be here. I have every right, Melissa, Catherine replied. She didn't sit down. She simply stood at the foot of the table, looking down at them with the detached pity of a veteran who had seen too many petty wars. I am the executor of Richard's estate. Any discussion regarding his assets, especially his shares in the startup, must go through me. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had paid the emotional dividends and covered the losses while they lived on a credit of affection that I was expected to provide indefinitely. But standing here, seeing them scramble, I realized my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. This wasn't a brunch. This was accounting. And the balance sheet was finally coming due. My mind drifted back to the years of being a guest star in my mother's life. I remembered the move to Menlo Park. I remembered the first time I saw the Palo Alto mansion, $8 million of glass and stone that felt as cold as a morgue. Melissa didn't think she was being cruel back then. She thought she was being efficient. This is the trap of cruel normalization. When people like my mother decide they deserve a certain lifestyle, everyone around them becomes a tool to maintain it. In her mind, she wasn't exploiting me or my father, she was simply optimizing her resources. To her, my father's overtime was a utility, like electricity. My silence was a feature, not a sacrifice. Melissa was staring at Catherine, her eyes shiny with tears that I knew were performative. She was preparing to play the victim. It was a role she had mastered over 20 years. I just wanted to make sure Madison and Jacob were okay, Melissa whispered, her voice trembling perfectly. Richard loved them like his own. How can you be so cold, Emily? Money has changed you. No, Mom, I said, meeting her gaze across the polished table. Money didn't change me. It just gave me the resources to stop pretending I didn't see who you really were. You aren't heartbroken about Dad. You're heartbroken that his shares are worth $25 million and you can't find the password to the vault. The meeting didn't end with a handshake. It ended with Melissa standing up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. She looked at me with a hatred that was finally honest. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You'll realize that when the world gets hard, you have no one. You've traded your family for a spreadsheet." "I traded a toxic subscription for a permanent license to my own life," I replied. "I think I got the better deal." As they filed out, the digital smear campaign began with clinical precision. Madison posted a series of curated stories on Instagram, her face arranged in a mask of heartbroken sincerity. She claimed I had abandoned a dying man and manipulated his fragile mental state to secure the startup shares. She portrayed Melissa as a grieving mother being bullied by a cold-hearted techie daughter. I didn't answer a single one. I went back to my spreadsheet. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I viewed their attacks as a denial-of-service attempt on my peace of mind. By 10 o'clock that night, Joshua shifted from social smear to financial sabotage. I watched my monitor as a series of failed login attempts hit my primary investment account. He was using my childhood data, the name of my first pet, the street I grew up on, to try and brute force his way into my father's tech stocks. Then the messages from Melissa started. They arrived in 3-minute intervals, a relentless stream of gaslighting. "Your father would be so ashamed of what you've become, Emily. We are losing the house because you refuse to be fair. Think about the children." I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I simply took screenshots of every attempt to reset my passwords and every threatening text. I moved the files into a folder labeled evidence. The Palo Alto mansion was no longer a home, it was a secure data center under siege. I sat across from Catherine, who was reviewing a fresh stack of legal filings. We moved the conflict from the dinner table to the federal level. I opened my laptop and accessed the Internet Crime Complaint Center portal. I filed the official report for the attempted identity theft and the coordinated brute force attacks. I attached the forensic data, the exact timestamps from the restaurant Wi-Fi, the specific hardware addresses traced back to Joshua's local network. Catherine set down her fountain pen and looked at me with a sharp, approving nod. She had just finished the final draft of the formal ultimatum for Joshua and Melissa. It was a cease and desist order that carried the full weight of her 50 years of legal experience. We demanded an immediate and permanent cessation of all contact. Failure to comply within 24 hours would trigger a lawsuit that would liquidate Joshua's remaining assets. Catherine entered the study at exactly 2:25 in the afternoon, her expression grimly satisfied. She dropped a thin, blue folder onto my desk. "Your father was right to be paranoid, Emily," she said. Joshua had secretly sold a foundational AI patent, the core engine of my father's startup, to a direct competitor for $7 million. He had used his position to gain access to the secure server at the Palo Alto mansion, acting as a parasite while sitting at our dinner table. But that wasn't the kill shot. I had been auditing the internal shareholder logs of the startup. I found a request for a liquidity transfer of $400,000 dated only 3 months ago. The document attached to the transfer bore my name and what looked like my signature. I ran a forensic overlay. It was a digital composite. Joshua had forged my signature to liquidate startup shares to cover his own debts. Joshua thought a simple copy-paste of my signature was enough to bypass the board's scrutiny. But he forgot a fundamental rule of digital forensics: metadata doesn't lie. I had already retrieved the original PDF of the transfer order and traced the hardware MAC address back to the very laptop sitting on the table in front of him. Moreover, the file's final edit timestamp was 3 a.m. on a public holiday, a window when my own system logs proved I was completely offline. He hadn't just forged my name, he had left his digital fingerprints on every pixel of the fraud. "This is no longer about a 65% redistribution," I said, my voice as steady as a bug report. "This is about identity theft, corporate espionage, and forgery. Despair is a low-value data point that I have no use for." I only felt the clarity of a completed balance sheet. Catherine nodded. "The FBI's cyber unit is already reviewing the report," but this patent evidence is the finisher. They aren't just losing the money, Emily. They are losing their freedom. The high-resolution smart glass of the Palo Alto mansion didn't just keep out the heat, it kept out the noise of people who had no right to my peace. I watched the external security feed. Melissa and Joshua had arrived. They didn't knock, they attacked the door. Melissa's face was contorted into a mask of pure desperation, her eyes red from rage. Joshua was beside her, his expensive suit rumpled, his hands trembling as he checked his phone. I thought for a moment about what this world would have been like if my father hadn't been so paranoid. If Catherine hadn't been standing behind me, I would have been erased. But the legacy systems of their manipulation were no longer compatible with my new operating system. Emily, open this door right now. Melissa's voice crackled through the intercom. You are destroying this family. You're going to put your own stepfather in prison. I didn't move. I simply tapped the control panel on the wall. The entire front facade of the house, the oversized smart glass panels, flickered and changed. They weren't mirrors now, they were high-definition displays. Suddenly, the driveway was flooded with the light from the screens. I projected the Federal Bureau of Investigation's preliminary investigation report in a font large enough for the neighbors to read. I displayed the forensic overlay of the signature Joshua had forged to steal $400,000. And then, the finisher. I pulled up the official notification from the state licensing board. Joshua's professional license had been revoked as of 10 o'clock this morning. I'm not putting anyone in prison, Melissa, I said, my voice broadcasting through the speakers. I'm simply projecting the logs of your own choices. You told me at brunch that we should handle this like adults. This is what adult accountability looks like. Joshua collapsed against the frame of his car, his shoulders sagging like a total system failure. Melissa stared at the screens, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. The Instagram filter was gone. The curated blessed life had been overwritten by a criminal record. The fallout for Melissa and Joshua was swift, clinical, and total. Within 6 months, Joshua's investment firm imploded under the weight of the patent theft and the forgery. They were forced to sell their mansion, their luxury cars, and every liquid asset to cover the restitution. I watched their descent from a distance and realized I was witnessing the illusion of power of an empty wallet. For decades, they had performed a version of success that was nothing but a shell rented with someone else's sweat. When the money vanished, they realized they had no internal character to keep them standing. I kept my father's founding shares and used them to establish the True Legacy Foundation. It is an organization dedicated to protecting orphans and marginalized young adults from the exact kind of financial exploitation I had narrowly escaped. I didn't do it for the social status. I did it because I knew firsthand how many people are trapped in systems that view them as a resource to be harvested. One rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year after my father's death, I sat in my quiet office in Menlo Park and opened my phone. I simply looked at the names, Melissa, Joshua, Madison, and Jacob, and I hit delete. I cleared the cache of my life. The silence that followed wasn't lonely, it was absolute sovereignty. I am writing this as a letter to those of you who have always felt like the invisible ones, the people who were kept at the table only because you were useful. For those of you who carry the ache of not belonging in your own home, understand that your worth is not a communal asset for others to manage. You don't have to stay in a prison just because the jailer shares your last name. You can build your own fortress. DNA makes you related, but loyalty and integrity are what make you family. This story is for everyone who had to become their own savior. If this resonated with you, please share it. Remember, DNA makes you related, but loyalty and integrity are what make you family. See you in the next story.